Hello everyone and welcome to our second USCIS study video. Today we are going to be looking at the different systems of government and answering several more questions. Since there is a lot of content in this topic, I am going to be breaking this lecture into two videos so as not to overwhelm you with too much information. As such, in the first part, we are going to be looking at what the different branches are and then an in-depth look at the first branch. So without wasting any more time, let's dive right in. So, in the government of the United States of America, it is split up into three different branches, with each one having certain functions or jobs in it. These three branches are known as the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Now, within these three branches of government, there are certain groups in them. In the legislative branch, we have the Congress, which has two parts to it, the Senate and the House of Representatives. We will be going into more in depth information on this in a little bit. We then have the executive branch, which contains the President and Vice President of the United States of America. And then in the judicial branch, we have the Supreme Court as well as other federal courts. Now, if you take a look to the right of your screen, I have a really great picture outlining and breaking down the different separations of each branch. Now, each one of these branches and groups have their own powers that are given to them under the Constitution, as well as their own jobs to do within the framework of our government. What makes them so unique, though, is that while working independently with their own groups and functions, they also must work together to make the government run smoothly and efficiently. Now, remember from the first video that even though these different branches and groups have their own powers, they are all still under the supreme law of the land. So, do you remember what the supreme law of the land is? I will give you a hint. It's at the top of the picture. That's right. It is the Constitution. So now, let me give you an example of how these three branches, while different, they work together for the running of the government. So, there was a concern about an environmental issue. These concerns were taken and debated in the legislative branch, which has the Congress in it. The Congress is, again, remember, broken up into two parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. After many months of meeting, a bill is drafted and passed in all the respective bodies for approval. Eventually, a consensus was reached, and a final bill was sent to the executive branch, which has the president in it for approval. Now, the president can either sign the bill and it becomes law, or he can send it back to the legislative branch for review, or he could veto it. In this case, the president signs it and it becomes law. Now, 6 months later, a group is found to be in violation of the new law, which they had a dispute with, and is taken to the courts. It will now be here in the judicial branch with the courts that the case will be heard and eventually determined if the law was broken or not. Now, as we talked about each of the three branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, how each of them have their own power. But here's a question. What prevents one branch, such as the president and the executive branch, from becoming more powerful than, say, the Congress and the legislative branch? Well, the answer is in the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. In the Constitution, there is something called checks and balances. What this means is there are powers and laws in place that limit each branch from becoming too powerful. There is also something called separation of powers, which is something we have talked a little bit about already, and each branch has their own specific power and part of the government. So the first that we're going to look in a little more in depth is the checks and balances. One check and balance that there is veto privileges, And this is specifically with the president. So when the Congress sends a bill to the president to be signed off into law, the president has the power to veto that bill. And once he vetoes it, it's sent back to the Congress. The Congress, with the Senate and the House of Representatives, they can potentially override the president's veto with a lot of difficulty, but that is definitely one of the checks and balances that is in place on the Congress. That means they just can't pass anything they want. Second checks and balance is set terms, and this will apply not only to the president but also to senators and the House of Representative members, which we'll look at in a little bit. And set terms means they can only stay in office for so long. So in the example, in case of a president, he can be in office for 4 years. Then he's got to run again for re-election to that office. Now, one of the different things from the president to other ones, such as senators or House of Representatives, is beyond the set terms lengths, there's also a limit on how many times they can run. So for a president, they can only run and be in office for 8 years, which is 2 terms. After that, they become ineligible to run for that office again. A third checks and balances is something that's specifically related to the Supreme Court, and it's the judicial review. Basically, this means that the courts can review any laws that Congress wants to pass and make sure that they're constitutional, that they're abiding by the supreme law of the land. Then we have executive and judicial impeachment by Congress. So if a member of one of those branches does something illegal, unconstitutional, the Congress could begin a process called impeachment, which is potentially removing that specific individual from office. Now, impeachment is a long process. It's time consuming. There's a lot involved, but it is something that specifically the Congress has over the other two branches. Now, for separation of powers, let's take a look at this and see some of the powers that each branch has. We've talked about them some of them in the check and balances section. We're going to start with Congress. So Congress has the sole power to declare war, as well as raise, support, and regulate the military. That is a power that's granted to the Congress. Now, again, remember, Congress is split up into two parts, the Senate and the House, and each one of those parts has specific powers that are given to them. So for the House of Representatives, they have the sole power of impeachment. So they are the ones that can start the impeachment process. And then the Senate, they will hold and do the trials for that impeachment. Now, for the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so he is the top guy. He's the one with the final say on giving orders. The president also has the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of an impeachment. This is a pretty big deal because if a president gives a pardon to an individual, and unless it's in the case of an impeachment, there's nothing the courts can do. And this is a power that's granted to the president. Now, for the courts, and specifically the Supreme Court, as we already talked about, they have judicial review, which they review the constitutionality of laws. They make sure that they're constitutional. The Supreme Court can also declare actions of the other two branches unconstitutional. So if you see a theme here, the Supreme Court, they deal with all the laws. They're the final say on the laws, and if something is constitutional or if it's not constitutional. So while each of these branches, they do have their own powers and responsibilities, they are still all under the Constitution, which means they are all under the rule of law. So, do you remember what the rule of law is? I'll give you a few seconds to try to think about that. And the rule of law is everyone must follow the law. Leaders must obey the law. Government must obey the law. And no one is above the law. So, now we're going to do a quick review before we go into more in-depth detail on each of the branches. A question will appear on the left side of your screen, and then in a few seconds, the answer will appear on the right. So I want you to try your best to answer these questions before they appear. Try to get your mind thinking on these answers. Try to draw it from memory. There will be a couple of questions from the first video. However, we did already mention them again in this video, so I'm not throwing you any surprises, any curveballs. So good luck on this, okay? So, question 1. Name one branch or part of the government. Name one branch or part of the government. The one branch will be either the legislative, executive, or judicial branch. And one of the acceptable answers for the part of the government would be Congress, President, or the courts. So whichever way is easiest for you to remember it and memorize it, either by the branches or the parts of the government that are in it, you got to remember at least one of them. Question 2. What stops one branch of the government from becoming too powerful? So we looked at this. Remember when we talked about all the powers that they had? So what stops one branch from becoming too powerful is the checks and balances and separation of power. Checks and balances, separation of powers. Question 3. What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress? Those are the Senate and the House of Representatives. Question 4. What is the supreme law of the land? The supreme law of the land is the Constitution. The Constitution. And finally, what is the rule of law? The rule of law. Remember, everyone must follow the law. Leaders must obey the law. Government must obey the law. No one is above the law. So you gotta remember that. No matter where you are, what position you are in the government, no one is above the law. So, now the first branch we are going to look at and zoom in and look at in more in-depth is the legislative branch. This branch, if you remember, consists of the Congress, which we have already seen has two parts to it. The first part is the Senate. The second part is the House of Representatives. So these two parts make up the Congress, and the Congress is the legislative branch. But so the question is, what do these people do? What does the Congress do? What is their job? Well, their job is they make federal laws. So now that we know what they do, we are going to look at each of these branches individually. And the first branch we're going to look at is the Senate. A U.S. Senator is an individual that is elected to this position for 6 years. And you're definitely going to want to remember that number because it's definitely going to be a question that will be asked of you. So, a U.S. Senator is elected for 6 years. Now, when a U.S. Senator is elected, um, who do they represent? Well, a senator is elected in the state that they're from, and when that individual is elected by the people of that state, they are the representatives of the people from that state in the Senate. So, for an example, when the people in California elect an individual as a senator and send them to the Senate, that person then represents the entire state of California. Now, each state, they don't only have one, they have two representatives for them in the Senate, which means that no matter how big or small the state is, there are always two senators. So, whether a state is as big as California or as small as like Massachusetts, the size of the state doesn't matter. Every state has two senators. Now, this is going to be important because when we look at the House of Representatives in a minute, this will be different. So, right now, we're taking what we know that each state has two senators and there are 50 states. This means that there are 100 U.S. senators in total. So 100 U.S. senators in total, and those 100 senators represent all the people of the state that elected them. So I know that's a lot of information, a lot of numbers. So let's do a quick review on that. Keep that fresh in our mind before we move on to the House of Representatives. So question one in our review is who does a U.S. senator represent? And if you remember, the U.S. senator represents all the people of the state that elected them. Question two is who makes federal laws? So, who in our government makes the federal laws? And that would be the Congress, which in turn is the Senate and House of Representatives, or the legislative branch. Any of those would be acceptable answers for your test. Congress, Senate, House of Representatives, or legislative branch. Third question. What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress? Two parts. We just talked about them. The two parts of the U.S. Congress are the Senate and the House of Representatives. How many U.S. senators are there? So, this question isn't asking per state. No, they want how many U.S. senators are there total. So remember, there are a total of 100 senators because that's two senators per state. There's 50 states, so that's 100 senators. And finally, we elect a U.S. senator for how many years? Remember, we elect them for 6 years. So they are in office for 6 years before they got to get reelected from the state that sent them. All right. Now, just to summarize all of that, for U.S. senators, remember they represent all the people of the state they're from. They served for 6 years, and there's 100 senators for each state. Well, 100 senators total because each state has two. Now, if you are following along with the USCIS study guide, which you can get off of their website, you may have noticed I skipped some questions about U.S. senators, and you will be correct. So there are 4 state-specific questions that it would be very hard to answer in this type of video or format because the answer you would give would vary depending on what state you're in and what state you're taking the test in. So, as such, I am going to be making a special video that will cover those state specific questions, and that will be coming out soon. Alright, so to move on, as our time is nearing an end for this video, we do want to look at the House of Representatives, which is the other part of the Congress. Now, people that serve in the House are known as U.S. representatives, and they only serve for 2 years before having to run again. So, unlike their counterparts in the Senate, where they serve for 6, the term of a representative is much shorter, and it is only 2 years. Also, unlike the Senate, the House has many, many more people in it. So, where the Senate only has 100 people in it, the House of Representatives actually has 435 voting members. Now, the reasoning for this huge number has to do with each state itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier when talking about the senators, and that there was only 2 no matter what the size of the state was, it's here in the House where the size does matter. So with the senators, it didn't. With the House of Representatives, it does. And you have to understand that when we're talking about the size, it's not the size of the state land-wise, but they're actually looking at the size population-wise. So if you're asked the question, why do some states have more representatives than other states? It's because of the size of the state's population and because they have more people. A great example of this, which you will see in my upcoming specialized video, but an example of this would be a state, say, like California compared to Alaska. Now, Alaska's a pretty big land. It's got a lot of territory. And California is really huge. But in California, we have 50 House of Representative members. Well, over 50. Whereas Alaska, even though it has all that territory, the population isn't as big. So they actually only have 1 House of Representative representation in the House. So, with time running out for this first part of the systems of government, let's do a review of everything that we covered in this video. Alright? So same thing, same format for the test here. Questions on the left, answers will be on the right. So question 1, name one branch or part of the government. What is one branch or part of the government? Correct answer would be legislative, executive, judicial branch, or Congress, president, or the courts. You got to remember one of those 6, whichever is the easiest one for you to remember. Question 2. What stops one branch of the government from becoming too powerful? Answer for that would be the checks and balances and separation of powers. Question 3. What are the 2 parts of the U.S. Congress? You should know the answer to this question by now. 2 parts of the U.S. Congress are the Senate and House of Representatives. Senate and House of Representatives. Who is in charge of the executive branch? The answer is the president. Who makes federal laws? Who makes the federal laws? Congress. Congress is an acceptable answer. State and House of Representatives or legislative branch. Any one of those 3 will be an acceptable, passable answer. How many U.S. senators are there? There are 100 U.S. senators. Remember, don't get tricked on this question. They're not asking how many senators there are per state. No, they want how many total U.S. senators are there, and that's 100. Part 2. We elect a U.S. senator for how many years? Remember, we elect them for 6 years. The House of Representatives has how many voting members? Remember, this part of the Congress has a lot more members than the Senate. They have 435 voting members. We elect a U.S. representative for how many years? Two. We elect them for 2 years. Remember, representatives only get elected 2 years. Senators are elected 6. Who does a U.S. senator represent? Who do they represent in the Congress? U.S. senators represent all the people of the state that elected them. Final question. Why do some states have more representatives than other states? It's because of the state's population or because they have more people. Any type of variation of one of these two answers will be a passable answer, because as long as the answer has to do it with the state's population or more people. That's why some states have more representatives than others. So congrats. With this video, we have now looked at 22 of the 100 of the civic questions you could be asked. Please rewatch this video if you need to. Like, share it, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video, which will be the second part of the systems of government, where we will look at the other 2 branches of government. Till then, have a great day.